Hello and welcome to Aero Innovations. I'm Aero and I'll be your host this evening. If you're new to the channel, I'm a longtime pro who specializes in the low stakes. So if you're looking to crush low stakes, no limit hold'em, then you've come to the right place. Tonight, I have a fan of the vlog mentioned that he'd be in town and wanted to meet up. So in honor of making accommodations for my fan, we'll be playing 1-3 no limit hold'em at the Wynn Encore in Las Vegas, where I bind for 500, which is the max. It's Sunday morning on February the 1st. We start the session at 1:28 in the morning. A few minutes into the session, under the gun opens to 10. I call in the +1 with ace-8 of clubs. The hijack, a much older gentleman whom I definitely categorize as an OMC, 3 bets to 35 with a large stack that has me covered. Under the gun calls. We're getting a great price for only 25 more, and we're definitely deep enough, so I make the call as well. The flop comes 7, ace, 10, rainbow. We flop top pair, but with a pretty weak kicker. One or both of our opponents could easily have us beat here. Even though we flop top pair, this is not the sort of board we were hoping for. So when under the gun checks, we check in flow, and thankfully the action checks around. The turn brings in an absolutely gorgeous 8 of hearts, putting 2 hearts on board, and more importantly, improving us to aces up. Jack 9 makes the nuts, but that aside, we are very confident we most likely have the best hand right now, losing only very specifically to a set. So when under the gun checks, I start processing how much to bet. I don't know what the under the gun player has, but he's most likely not much of a concern given the action so far. The hijack has one of 3 most likely hands. Either he's holding a big pocket pair like kings or queens, which won't call for very much on this sort of board, especially against 2 other opponents. He could be slow playing a set with a hand like pocket aces or pocket tens. And lastly, he might have decided to pot control on the flop with a hand like ace king. In any of those 3 situations, I think a bet on the smaller side here is warranted because one of us is drawing to extremely few outs. So I decide on a price of $60, which is slightly above a half pot size bet. Interestingly enough, both opponents end up making the call. The river brings in a completely unsightly card in the form of a king of spades. This card is about as bad as it gets. If we put the hijack on either pocket kings or ace king, this river card just smashed the heck out of his range. Under the gun checks again for a 3rd time. Had the river been some small innocuous card or an insignificant card that paired the board other than a 10, I probably would have smashed here for close to like 200. But the river being what it is, I contemplate putting out a blocker bet for like $60 or so. But then I think better of it. I think any amount I fire here will fly straight into the abyss and never come back. So instead, I decide on a check. As expected, the hijack fires out a considerable bet for 150. I am folding here for sure, regardless of what the under the gun player decides to do. But after about 30 seconds in the tank, under the gun eventually decides to call, which makes this a very clear fold. The hijack tables his hand to reveal ace king, as we very much expected, and under the gun says he had ace jack. Poker requires a lot of mental discipline. That king on the river hit everything we expected the hijack to be holding. So I had the discipline to check on the river with every intention of folding even though I had aces up. Meanwhile, the under the gun player couldn't even fold just top pair with a mediocre kicker that can't beat much of anything, especially against a typecasted OMC opponent. Sometimes even when you're holding a monster, if the board gives an unfavorable run out and the player tendencies indicate that you're beat, you just need to fold and save yourself some money. I go completely card dead for the next hour and 10 minutes and don't pick up a single playable hand until I get involved in this next hand. I often get asked how I get so many strong hands in a single 4-hour session. You guys do realize I'm only playing a highlight reel, right? Like for instance, here I literally just folded every single hand for over an hour straight. My cards never even make it to see a flop. You can see all of the sorts of hands I fold in one of my Every Hand Revealed 100 plus hands videos, but for my normal vlogs, I don't bother showing you all of that nonsense. So anyways, here under the gun and +1 limp, I raised to 20 in the hijack with ace jack of spades, using a larger than normal size to account for the 2 limpers. Under the gun calls with a large stack of about 900 and the +1 folds. The flop comes 8, deuce 4, rainbow. We don't flop anything whatsoever except for 2 random overcards. Under the gun checks. The vast majority of the time, I will check back on low boards that don't make much sense for my range when I'm the original raiser. But this board is pretty polarizing. There's not a whole lot out there. Our opponent could have easily missed this flop as well, or maybe he's only holding some sort of mediocre hand, like the small pocket pairs ranging from 5s through 7s. That sort of hand will be able to call a flop bet, but will have a much harder time sticking around until the river. So I start with another stale c-bet of 20 bucks. Our opponent makes the call. The turn brings in a queen of clubs. Under the gun checks again. At first this may not seem like a very good card since we did not in fact improve. However, it's a card that smashes our range, even if it didn't hit our actual hand. We could very easily be sitting here with ace queen or king queen, for instance. When betting with air or a semi-bluff, you should definitely use scare cards to help stress your point. I continue the aggression with a much larger bet of 60 into the pot of 87. This gets the job done as our opponent simply just folds. A few minutes later, the cutoff limps. It's our friend Young Lee, featured in a few of my previous vlogs. The small blind folds, and I check my option with king 4 of hearts in the big blind. No need to bloat this pot up out of position. The flop comes 4, 5, king with 2 clubs. We flop the top and bottom 2 pairs on a pretty wet board with various straight draw possibilities, as well as the obvious flush draw. In a limp pot, when there's very little money in the middle, it's okay to overbet the pot because the absolute value will still be a very small number. So I shoot out a $10 bet into the $7 pot. Our opponent calls. The turn brings in a king of diamonds, improving us to a much desired full house, losing only very specifically to king 5. Yes, we have a nearly unbeatable hand, but as you guys know, I don't slow play almost ever. Since our hand is so utterly strong, however, I want our opponent to continue with his entire range, whether that's a flush draw, a straight draw, a king, or some sort of middling pocket pair. So this time I shoot out a deceptively small bet for another 10 bucks. And it's music to our ears when our opponent raises to 25 with a short stack of about 145 bucks. The top card is paired, and our opponent is super short stacked. There's no reason to do anything fancy here other than to simply shove, so I just stick in all of the beans, and Young Lee snap calls. I fast roll our full house. The river brings in a queen of clubs. Young Lee tables pocket 5s for a smaller full house, so we scoop this nice little pot to be up for the day so far. 10 minutes later, the under the gun, low jack, and hijack all limp when I look down at pocket 10s in the small blind. I have a great hand, but my position sucks, and there have also already been 3 limpers. A normal raise for this sort of hand will be between 5 to 6 blinds, plus an additional big blind to account for each of the 3 limpers. So you're looking at a raise of between 8 to 9x. I'm also going to add a few extra bucks for being out of position, so I throw out a very large raise to 30 bucks. Yes, I literally just used a 10x raise size. If you play 1-2 or 1-3, you should definitely try to mimic some of my bet sizes as well. It'll really help your big pocket pairs not get cracked. For this large sizing, only the low jack makes the call. The flop comes 3, deuce 7 with 2 spades, which is about as good as it gets. We maintain an overpair several points higher than the board. With a vulnerable hand like pocket 10s on a very favorable board, I don't want to screw around. For such a large preflop raise, our opponent could very easily have a hand here like pocket 8s or 9s, and be willing to get it all in. So I shoot out a very large c-bet of 50 bucks into the pot of 69. Our opponent goes all in for about 110 bucks, and of course we make the snap call. The turn brings in an ace of hearts, and the river completes with an ace of diamonds. Our opponent tables king jack of spades for a flush draw with 2 overs, but we evaded all of the bad cards like Neo from the Matrix to scoop another modest pot. Get ready, boys and girls, because this one's about to go off the rails. Since we've lost a few players, we're currently only 6-handed for this one. Here, Micah straddles to 6 under the gun. He's the fan that was hoping to see and play with me. Everyone folds around to me in the big blind, where I look down at queen 6 of spades. I decide to defend for $3 more. Suddenly, the straddle wakes up with the raise to 26, with a stack just shy of 500 bucks. I can just fold here, but I decide to go a much more aggressive route. You actually wake up with a monster your first hand in the straddle? I find that hard to believe. I limp raise the action up to 86 bucks, using a very large sizing designed to fold out the vast majority of hands since we'll be playing the rest of this hand out of position if called. Unfazed, Micah makes the call, which is a very unorthodox play since we're both so shallow. I think he either has a middling pocket pair of some sort or maybe an ace-x type of hand, and very occasionally even suited connectors since I don't actually know how he plays. The flop comes deuce, king, king, rainbow. We don't flop anything whatsoever. But it's very conceivable that Micah didn't flop anything either. This is a pretty polarizing board. If I have a hand here like ace-king or king-queen, then Micah is drawing extremely thin at best. And if he called us pre-flop with 2 picture cards containing a king, then whatever money I'm about to fire out is just going to disappear into the ether, never to be seen again. I should definitely c-bet on this sort of flop, and I don't really need to use a very large sizing either. A third pot size bet of about $60 should do the trick. Instead, in the moment, I have an absolute brain fart and fire out an incredibly tiny bet of a mere $15. This is the sort of sizing I would use if I flopped quads, not sitting here with a freaking queen 6 and no pair and no draw whatsoever. This is the sort of sizing I would use if I wanted Micah to continue with his entire range. So obviously, our opponent makes the call. The turn brings in a 5 of hearts, putting 2 hearts on board. We didn't get raised on the flop, which we would have expected Micah to do if he had any sort of king, since I used such an egregiously small size, even smaller than my bite-sized Asian peepee. So unless our opponent randomly hit that 5, or he's holding a middling pocket pair of some sort, I should be able to get him to fold a large portion of his hands here if I increase my aggression. I throw out a bet of 65 into the bloated pot of 202, although in all honesty, I should have just used that sort of bet sizing on the flop. After a bit of consideration, Micah makes the call. The river brings in a 3 of hearts, completing the backdoor flush draw. We brick any hope or possibility of hitting a pair, and now I'm sitting here with queen freaking high. There's a 0% chance we're any good here. On top of that, there's no reason why our opponent can't have hearts either. It really sucks being out of position when you make this sort of play. To be honest, I should have either continued the flop with a third pot size bet, or simply just checked to gain some information, and gone for a 2 street type of bluff. Instead, we've arrived at this river with absolute squadoosh, and I'm sitting here regretting some of my life choices. The pot is currently 332, and Micah has about 320 left in his stack. Exactly a pot-sized bet. If I had a value hand here, like the backdoor flush or a hand containing that king, this would be the perfect spot for an all-in shove. Micah would be hard-pressed to lay down a hand here like pocket 8s, or something similar, if that's what he's holding. I wish we were deeper, so I could use a much larger bet as a bluff. So now I could either give up at this point and just forfeit what we've invested so far, or I could go for a Hail Mary shove. I only need to get this bluff through 1 and 2 times to be profitable, since my all-in shove will be slightly smaller than the pot. If Micah calls here half the time and folds the other half, then this would actually be a slightly plus EV move. I don't know of Micah's capabilities or his risk threshold, but most 1-3 players don't really like hero calling for their entire stack with a mediocre hand. And I really don't like giving up, so I opt for the path of violence, and after some noticeable delay, decide to just stick it all in. Micah starts to tank, which is never good because I would prefer a snap fold, but at least we evaded the snap call. After about a minute and a half in the tank, Micah eventually comes to the right decision and sticks in the correct call. I table our silly queen high, and he turns over ace 5 of clubs for an excellent hero call. Good job, man. Very well done. He properly deduced that I was full of air, and took down this massive pot of nearly $1,000. Yeah, my biggest mistake was definitely on the flop. If I just made a proper c-bet there, I could have avoided this entire fiasco. After this fumble, our stack falls into the slight negatives, so we have to top off for another $100. As you can see, I don't always get smashed by the deck, and I also sometimes fumble and make terrible plays. What's important is to keep your head in a good space and not let this sort of stuff get to you. Just dust yourself off and move on. 15 minutes later, the cutoff raises to 15 with a stack of about 150. The action folds around to me in the big blind, where I'm holding 4-6 of diamonds. It's not really good to be holding suited connectors out of position, because most of your draws will be incredibly face up, but I think I have a pretty strong edge against our opponent, so I decide to make the call for $12 more. The flop comes Jack, 9, King with 2 diamonds. We end up in the exact spot we were hoping to avoid. We flop a flush draw on a board that's very favorable for our opponent's range. I start with a check. The cutoff throws out a very small c-bet for 15 on a board I would consider incredibly wet. Usually most opponents would use a larger sizing here. Obviously, with our flush draw, we can't go anywhere, so I make the call. The turn brings in a 5 of clubs, which doesn't help us whatsoever. Again, I put in another check. This time, our opponent checks the action back. Okay, goody. She doesn't have a whole lot. I can probably bluff a large majority of river cards with a large bet, assuming we don't improve. But instead, the river brings in a 3 of diamonds. We actually do improve to a 6 high flush. Okay, so now we need to switch our plan to a value bet instead. But how big of a bet should I use? If our opponent had continued on the turn with another decent sized bet, this would be just a clear shove. But instead, she checked the action back, which means her hand isn't all that strong. If I had to guess, she probably has ace-jack. Such a hand can't beat a king, and it can't beat the obvious flush either. So I need to use an amount here that she'd be willing to hero call light. I fire out a very small half-pot size bet for 30. She reluctantly makes the call, so we table our hand and take the small pot down. For this next hand, we've gained a couple of players, so we're back up to 8-handed again. Here, the low jack opens for 15 with a stack of about 200 bucks. The button 3-bets to 30, using a very peculiar min-raise sizing. The small blind suddenly puts in a massive 4-bet to 130. He's the same opponent who made that bad call with the ace-jack in that very first hand, where we folded the ace-8 two pairs. I'm sitting here with pocket 9s in the big blind. Even if we factor that the small blind might be a bit loosey-goosey, there's no way we can ever cold call here in this configuration. We're facing a 4-bet before the action has even gotten to us. We're not deep enough to set mine, and there's no reason why one of the other opponents can't simply just shove and open the action back once more. So unfortunately, this is just a reluctant fold. The low jack ends up going all in for 204 bucks. The button folds, and the small blind makes the snap call. So let's see what happens. The board runs out 8 high, and the low jack only has ace-jack offsuit. But the small blind tables pocket queens for a much larger pocket pair than ours. So if we had called pre-flop, we would have pissed away like at least 500 bucks this hand with the run out. 15 minutes later, under the gun opens to 15. I call in the middle position with 5-7 of clubs, and the small blind and big blind calls as well. The flop comes 3-7-4, rainbow with 1 club. We flop top pair with a gut shot draw, as well as a backdoor flush draw. The action checks around to me. Checking here would be a mistake, since any random high card could take the lead away from me. I want to use a decently strong bet since we have position and everyone else has checked. So I throw out a 2/3 pot size bet of 40 into the $60 pot. Only the big blind ends up making the call. He's a new player to the table who came over with a massive stack of over 3,500 bucks, which is just insane for a 1-3 that's capped at a $500 buy-in. The turn brings in a jack of spades, keeping the board rainbow. Big blind checks again. Sure, we could very well be beat here, and it's even possible the big blind could be slow playing a flop set or even a straight. This jack shouldn't make much of a difference though, since it's a pretty random high card. I want to find out exactly where we're at. I fire out another bullet for 60 into the pot of 140. If we face a check raise here, this will be a very clear fold. Instead, our opponent only just calls. The river brings in a king of diamonds, not completing any draws whatsoever. Suddenly, the big blind comes out firing with a substantial bet of 165. Unless he were very specifically holding king 7, this river bet just doesn't make any sense. We beat hands like ace deuce and 8-5, which would have flopped a double gut shot draw. Even though I only have third pair here, with a kicker that doesn't play, for me, this is a very easy snap call. Our opponent simply just folds his hand, so we win this pretty considerable pot. 20 minutes later, we've since lost a few players again, so we're currently short-handed with only 5 players. I open to 15 under the gun with my least favorite premium starting hand. Oh yes, we're talking about the accursed pocket kings. The cutoff and button fold, but the small blind puts in a 3-bet to 50. He's the same opponent who tried to bluff us off in that last hand, the guy with the absolutely massive stack. The big blind folds, so the action is back around to me. I get the impression that our opponent is an action player, so I want to get in as much money into the middle as possible. I put in a 4-bet to 150, and our opponent makes the call. The flop comes 7, jack, queen, rainbow. Small blind checks. Okay, So this normally wouldn't be the best flop in the world for a 4-bet pot, since our opponent could easily have pocket jacks or pocket queens here. But this guy's an action player, so he's not going to have a lot of your traditional hands here. I start with an incredibly small c-bet for 75 into the pot of 304, studying our opponent's facial expressions for any possible reads. He's a very expressive guy, and makes a face like he doesn't like this board whatsoever, but reluctantly makes the call. The turn brings in a 9 of hearts, keeping the board rainbow. King 10 makes the nuts, and 8-10 makes a straight as well. Again, our opponent checks. This board is starting to get a bit more connected, so I ramp up my aggression slightly with a bet of 160 into the pot of 454, which is barely a third pot size bet. My chosen bet sizing is always based upon what I think my opponent is holding and how much I think I can get him to call. Plus, we're currently short-handed, so our opponent's range is much wider in this configuration. On this sort of board, I think he has an incredibly weak hand here. Maybe something like ace-jack, or a small pocket pair that's not on the board. Even for this incredibly small bet with proportion to the pot, our opponent tanks for about 45 seconds before eventually putting in the fold, saying he folded pocket eights. 15 minutes later, we've gained a few players again, so we're currently back up to 8-handed. Here I limp under the gun with pocket threes. The low jack raises to 10. The hijack, cutoff, small blind, and big blind all call, so obviously I call as well. We go 6-handed to a flop of 3, 3, king, rainbow. We literally just flopped quads, but unfortunately it's on an incredibly polarizing board. Freaking quadzilla. The small blind leads with a $20 bet into the pot of 60. Nothing to do here but simply just call and hope we get more action from the players behind. But unfortunately, everyone else just folds. The turn brings in an 8 of spades, putting 2 spades on board. Small blind leads for a second time with a bet of 45. Okay, so at this point I should just raise, to be honest. I should min raise here to about 90 or even make it an even $100. Yes, I do realize I have quads, but when our opponent leads with a bet into 5 other opponents, he can only ever have a king here. On this innocuous looking 8, which shouldn't make any difference whatsoever, I should expect our opponent to be able to continue against a small raise. But I'm going to admit that I am not the best at playing super nutted hands. Instead of raising here, which would be the ideal play, again I only just call. The river brings in an uncomfortable ace of diamonds. Now all kings will chop on this sort of runout. I should never have ace-king here since I only just limp called the $10 raise, so this ace shouldn't make much of a difference. Unfortunately, our opponent slows down and checks. The way that I played the hand, I would have definitely raised much sooner if I only had a 3. So I verbally announce that I guess we're chopping and shoot out a large bet of 135 into the pot of 190. Unfortunately, my ploy fails and our opponent simply just folds. Small pot, but still nice to get quads. It's a full hour later until we get involved in our next notable hand. A full hour of folding while getting dealt garbage cards just like the rest of the poker community. Here, the middle position limps. The button puts in a tiny raise to $10. I can just as easily fold here since I'm holding a pretty disconnected hand with Jack 7 offsuit in the big blind. But since I haven't gotten anything decent in over an hour, I decide to get a bit squirrely and put in a loose call, and the middle position calls as well. The flop comes queen, 10, 9, rainbow. We flop an open-ended straight draw. The action checks around. The turn brings in an 8 of spades, putting 2 spades on board. We improve to a straight, losing only very specifically to a slow played jack-king. I decide to get sneaky and check for a second time to see what our opponents would like to do. The middle position checks, but the button throws out a half pot size bet of 15. Maybe he's just betting his position, or maybe he just picked up a flush draw. Either way, I throw out a check raise to a substantial $70. The middle position quickly gets out of the way, but things get uncomfortable when the button throws out a massive re-raise to 180, with a very large stack of about $900. This was not the reaction I was hoping for. He's saying he has at least a jack, and in the worst case scenario, he could even be holding jack-king. If I call here, I'd most likely have to call an incredibly large river bet of probably around $400 or so. I don't really want to invest calling for another $110 and then maybe another $400 on the river, only to just chop at best. especially when I might even be drawing dead. So after some contemplation, I decide to put in a disciplined fold, only to have our opponent proudly table Jack 10 for a guaranteed chop. In order to make that call, I would need to be holding a Jack with 2 spades at the bare minimum, or even Ace Jack, where I can river a King for the nuts, something with some possibility to improve. You never want to put in huge amounts of money only to chop in the very best case scenario. I'd rather make a bad fold in that spot than to make a non-believing call and possibly lose several $100s. 20 minutes later, there's a live 6. The action player raises to 21 in the cutoff. The button calls. I'm sitting here with my absolute favorite one-pair hand in the big blind. I'm talking about pocket freaking aces, the Phil Ivey of live action poker. We're all pretty deep since I have about $850 and both of my opponents have me covered. So I bump things up to 81. Both of my opponents make the call. The flop comes 5, 3, 6 with 2 clubs and a diamond. For an $81 pre-flop 3-bet, what sorts of hands can we expect from our opponents? Usually big ace-high types of hands like ace-queen and ace-king, but we have 2 of those aces blocked. So that leaves a lot of middling pocket pairs, right? This super low board should be great for their range to have an overpair. So I decide to get a bit tricky and start with a check. The cutoff action player takes the bait and throws out a bet of 85. The button folds. We're not going to let him get away with a third pot size bet. So I put in the good old fashioned arrow check raise to 300, setting the SPR for a nice turn shove. Our opponent obliges and makes the call. The turn brings in a beautiful king of spades, not completing any draws, and also not being a card I should have any cause for concern. The pot is currently 844 and I have less than $500 left in my stack. So I make the only rational play and shove all in for my last remaining $470 or so. Our opponent tanks for about 30 seconds before folding 7-8 offsuit for a disciplined fold with an open-ended draw. I'm actually very shocked he folded such a hand. We definitely confirmed that he's an action player without a doubt, since he raised and then called a very large 3-bet with 7-8 offsuit, but he still had the discipline to fold on this sort of board even after flopping open-ended? Even with the pot being as large as it was? Still, I'm always happy to get a guaranteed check mark. Okay, so let me break the math down for you guys. You can see with only 1 card to go, holding an open-ended draw with 8 clean outs and 44 cards remaining in the deck, our opponent only has about an 18% chance to improve. Facing an all-in of $470, if you divide 470 by 18%, you get a number very close to $2,600. This means our opponent would have to win a pot of $2,600 to break even on his call. With the pot being only 844, facing a bet of 470, and a call of 470, the new pot, if my opponent calls, would only be $1,784, which is considerably less than the $2,600 he needs for a break-even call. So our opponent actually made a very good fold, even for an action player. Okay, so now let's change things up, and let's say our opponent had 7-8 of clubs instead of 7-8 offsuit. In this example, our opponent would have over 31.8% chance of improving against our particular hand. So in this case, if you divide 470 by 31.8%, you actually get a number of only $1,477. So our opponent would only need to win a pot of $1,477 to break even on his call. And seeing as the new pot would be $1,784, it would be a clear and definite call in that case. And this is how you calculate pot odds for an all-in situation. 45 minutes later, I open to 10 under the gun with pocket 4s. Even though I have an action player on the table with high volatility, I've racked up a deep enough stack to be comfortable calling here in case I face a 3-bet. The middle position and hijack both call, when surely enough, right on cue, the action player 3-bets things up to 30 from the small blind. The big blind folds. This is a very small raise, but we always want to be ultra deep when set mining, so no need to do anything here other than simply flat call, which brings along the middle position and the hijack as well. We go 4 ways to an absolutely beautiful flop of ace, king, 4, rainbow. The 4 was actually the window card. The small blind surprisingly checks, and the action is over to me. I'm not a very big fan of slow playing, like almost ever, but this board is incredibly dry. There's not a whole lot out there except for a few gut shot draws. I decide to get a bit sneaky and check the action back, and the action ends up checking around. The turn brings in a 7 of clubs, putting 2 clubs on board. The small blind finally decides to throw out a bet, but it's only for a very disappointing 20 bucks into the pot of 123. Okay, no more slow playing. I pump things up to a considerable 120. The other 2 opponents fold, but the small blind makes the call. The river brings in a queen of diamonds. Jack 10 makes the nut straight. Our opponent checks. Unless he were very specifically holding Jack 10 of clubs, we should have the check mark here. If he missed the flush draw, he's not paying much of anything. So how much should we bet here? Considering he checked the flop and then led with a very weak bet on the turn, I don't think he has much more than a 1 pair type of holding. So I fire out a bet of 200 into the pot of 363. Our opponent quickly makes the call, so we table our hand and take this one down. With how fast he called on the river, I realized I could have made a much larger bet and still gotten called, but I couldn't have known that at the time with how the hand went down. A few minutes later, I opened a 10 in the cutoff with Jack 8 of diamonds. I realize this is a suited double gapper, but I have a good position. The small blind and big blind both end up calling. The flop comes 9, 7, king, rainbow. We flop a gut shot draw, but not a whole lot else. The action checks to me. I'm on the fence here between betting and checking, but this time I decide to check the action back. The turn brings in a 6 of hearts, improving us to an open-ended straight draw. This time, when the action checks to me for a second time, I throw out a half pot size bet of 15. The small blind calls, but the big blind folds. The river brings in a 3 of spades. We do not in fact improve. But when the small blind checks for a third time, I think his range is pretty capped. So I throw out a massive overbet for an even 100 bucks into the $60 pot. Surely enough, after about 15 seconds, this gets the job done, and we steal this pot with Jack high. For the last hand of the night, I decide to get a bit frisky and limp under the gun with Jack 10 offsuit, which is a move I will very rarely ever make with such a weak hand. The cutoff and button both limp as well, when the small blind action player puts in a raise to 15 bucks. The big blind, myself, and both of the other limpers make the call, so we go 5-handed to a flop of Jack 4-9 rainbow. We flop top pair with a mediocre kicker. The action checks to me. See, this is why I don't normally play these sorts of hands. We have top pair, but we're not very comfortable with where we stand in the hand. I throw out a feeler bet of 30 into the pot of 75. Thankfully, the cutoff and button both fold, but the small and big blinds both make the call. I feel much better about our hand now. If either of these players had a better hand, they would have just let out themselves. I was more worried about the cutoff or button holding a hand like Jack Queen or Jack King. The turn brings in a Jack of diamonds, putting 2 diamonds on board. I'm a huge fan of this card. I don't know what sorts of wacky draws our opponents are on, but surely this Jack couldn't have helped them. So when they both check to me, I don't want to use a very large sizing here. Middle and bottom pairs on the flop are now drawing dead, so I'm only worried about random gut shot draws and maybe hands like Queen 10 or 8-10, both of which I would see coming from a mile away. So I continue with another meek bet of 80 into the pot of 165. This time, both opponents simply just fold, so we take another small pot down. Alright, so I mutilated the cash out, so you guys are going to have to deal with this outro instead. So we played just under 7 hours and we made a little over $1,000, so that was pretty good. I normally don't play this long, but I had a friend on the table who was stuck pretty deep, so I wanted to give him a chance to get back to even. Didn't work out so well for him. So I had the one big blunder with the bluff that did not go through, but that's okay because we were able to recover and still made a really good profit. So I hope you guys enjoyed the vlog and I'll see you next time.